Hello and welcome to the RotoWire WNBA show, where we talk about fantasy basketball. I'm Jason Shebilske alongside Kirien Sprecher. Today we'll discuss the games from this past weekend, including several surprising outcomes. We'll also, with the ESPN fantasy trade deadline also coming up Friday, we'll give you some last minute targets. And finally, we'll break down what we're expecting from this week's action in the WNBA. Those looking to test RotoWire's full slate of tools can visit rotowire.com/try for a free trial. And if you have questions during the show, you can ask them in the comments and we'll get them answered. If they're asked live, we'll talk about them on the show, but you can also ask them afterward and we'll get them answered in the comments. Kieran, we talked Friday about how the Dream needed to step things up to show they could compete without Ryan Howard. They did so by taking down the Sun on Friday before narrowly losing to the Liberty on Sunday. Excuse me. What impressed you about Atlanta this weekend?
I mean, it starts with Jordin Canada, right? She missed a lot of time, came back first minute restriction off the bench. Then she played a lot of like 30, close to 30 minutes off the bench. And now the last game of the weekend, she was starting. She's officially off that restriction. She scored 18 points, had 15 assists, 8 rebounds, 4 steals, and a block over the 2 games this weekend. Really strong production. But you also, I feel like Canada was the fire that they needed, but you also got to give credit to Tina Charles and Alyssa Gray, right? Tina Charles has been fantastic all season, putting up double-double production. Gray needed to bounce back after averaging just 11 points on 18% shooting. That's not a typo. 18% shooting over her previous 3 games. She was much better this weekend, and that was a big boost to Atlanta, along with Canada being removed from that minute restriction, right? Maya Caldwell also was added to the Dreams rotation this weekend. That might have been because Ariel Powers was dealing with some injuries. I don't think Caldwell needs to be rostered in fantasy at this point, but she is getting pretty good PT over the weekend. And she probably should be a player to monitor if Powers and Howard continue to miss time.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times with these players who missed the first few weeks or the first month of the season, such as Jordin Canada did, we'll forget about them a little bit and minimize their impact a little bit when they come back. But Canada was incredibly productive during her time in Los Angeles. And if she can continue to have her role grow, which she played 38 minutes on Sunday, so you can't grow much more than that. But if she can increase her production and really become a focal point for Atlanta while Ryan Howard is sidelined, I think that she has a lot of potential to make a big splash.
Yeah, and I mean, I bought into the hype. I've said it before, but during preseason action, that all reports out of Atlanta was that Canada was going to be the starting point guard. And obviously with players like Gray and Howard and Tina Charles surrounding a point guard like Canada, like you said, she's had a history of putting up production. I felt really strong about Canada's value this season. Obviously the injury just completely ruined that, but I think Canada is a top tier player. Maybe not, tier 1 or 2, but she's a really solid player for the second half of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like as long as Ryan Howard isn't there, the opportunities will be there for Canada to really make an impact. We also saw the end of one streak as Asia Wilson was held below 20 points Saturday, but we saw another one narrowly continue with Angel Reese posting her 10th consecutive double-double. Is Angel Reese in the Rookie of the Year conversation for you, or is the award still Caitlin Clark's to lose?
Look, Reese has been fantastic. She's completely blown away everyone's preseason predictions. She's rebounding. She's leading the league in reboundings, but she's shooting only 39.6% from the field. And I feel like a lot of her rebounds are coming off her own misses around the basket. She averages 4.8 offensive rebounds. I'm not saying all 4.8 of her 11 rebounds per game are offensive. And I'm not going to say all of those are rebounds off of her own misses. She is a really good offensive rebounder. And that's a great trait to have as a big. But I do think the rebounding numbers are a little inflated because she's just missing shots and getting her own rebounds. Compare that to Clark. Clark has had her own struggles from the field. They're shooting basically the same percentage, but that's the way it goes with guards. Clark is shooting 30-footers and Reese is shooting layups. So you kind of expect the bigs to have a much higher field goal percentage. Obviously that doesn't hurt Reese in fantasy, but I just think from like a player award type of deal that will impact her. I also think you have to look past the counting stats when making this argument. Like Reese's counting stats are great. Clark's counting stats are also great and probably better in most cases than Reese. But I think the argument here that Reese really isn't in the conversation quite yet. She's in the conversation. I'll say that, but she isn't like, she shouldn't be the favorite and, like by any means. And I think that's just because Clark is the focal point of every opposing defense. If you watch an Indiana Fever game, there's 2, 3, 4 players, all eyes on Clark at all times. And she's being asked to score and distribute and play defense. Clark's defensive stats have been really good this year. So Clark's being asked to do more and she's delivering. So I think that just gives her the upper hand on Reese for now. I'm not going to write Reese out yet. But I think the Sky would need to finish ahead of the Fever if both players maintain the similar stat lines that they've had through the first half of the season.
Yeah, I was curious last night, so I looked on DraftKings, and I want to say that Angel Reese was plus 475 to win Rookie of the Year, and I believe Caitlin Clark was somewhere in like the minus 600, minus 500 range, which feels right for both players. I think that if you want to bet on Angel Reese to win Rookie of the Year, it isn't inherently a bad bet, but there's a lot of risk that comes with it because of just how good Caitlin Clark has been. You look at her performance this weekend, and she almost posted a triple-double, which I think would have been the first for a rookie, or she would have been the youngest player to do it. But she did that while apparently feeling under the weather, which Christy Sides revealed after the game. So Caitlin Clark has been incredibly impressive, but I think that Angel Reese also deserves her due because she's doing something that no other player has done in a single season, regardless of whether you're a rookie. Many people consider Candace Parker one of their WNBA GOATs, and to see Angel Reese already in that conversation with Parker is really, really cool to see this early in her career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think DraftKings having Reese at plus 475 is showing her a ton of respect, honestly, in my opinion. I think that's a pretty fair line. Just to run through some of the stats comparing the two, because, that's what we do. We're a fantasy show. We talk about stats. Clark is 6th in minutes played. Reese is 27th. That's among all the WNBA players. So even Clark is playing a lot of minutes, but Reese is also like a focal point of her team and a key part of their team. And then, you look at, what did I say? I think I messed that up. Yeah. Clark is 6th in minutes played and Reese is 27th. Reese leads all the league in rebounds, which is crazy for a rookie, but Clark leads all guards. So Clark has been a great rebounder. She's just narrowly ahead of that. So, maybe one bad rebounding game, she drops down, but currently Clark leads all guards in the entire WNBA in rebounds. Clark is also 3rd in the league in assists. Clark is averaging 6.9, and the leader, Alyssa Thomas, is only at 7.6. So Clark could really surpass and become the top assist player with another couple. She had like 12, 13 dimes last night, a couple more performances like that, and she could be leading the league in assists. Then you go to points. Clark is 15th, Reese is 27th. Not like blowing anything out of the water. Obviously, their field goal percentages, like I mentioned earlier, impacts those numbers. And as their careers evolve and they get more confident in whatever, they're going to go. One of the biggest stats that pops out to me when comparing these two players, though, is Caitlin Clark, the guard, averages nearly a block per game. Angel Reese has 2 block shots all season. So that, as a big, she's grabbing a lot of rebounds. I think she's a pretty good defender, but the block shots just aren't there right now. And that might be like one of the final straws in the coffin for her Rookie of the Year case.
Yeah, and I think that so many people, when Caitlin Clark transitioned to the pro level, expected to see those really flashy scoring performances, which we've gotten a few flashes of that scoring production from her and a few logo threes as well. But I think that what she's doing in her peripheral stats really stands out and makes her game at the professional level all that much more impressive.
For sure. And obviously, I didn't mention the turnovers. Clark does have a lot of turnovers. I also feel like, you can go on Twitter and you can find some threads of teammates dropping passes that get charged to Clark. But, as my middle school basketball coach once said, you have to know who you're passing to, right? So, it's always going to be on the passer. If someone, you pass it to a big and they fumble it out of bounds. Well, don't pass it to the big who's running full speed down the thing. You got to make a better pass that. So obviously the turnovers are probably the biggest stain on Clark's Rookie of the Year candidacy at this point. But I think you just got to live with that, with how much she handles the ball for a rookie.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, the Fever took down the Mercury last night, and Indiana would qualify for the playoffs if the season ended today, while the Sky, Wings, Sparks, and Mystics would be out. Of the 4 teams on the outside right now, who do you see claiming a playoff spot?
Well, before I answer your very tough question, I just got to say that the Fever's collapse against the Sky 2 Sundays ago, they were up double digits late in the third quarter of that game, could really loom large later in the season. The Fever have already played 3 more games than the Sky, so the standings are kind of a little wonky, even though they're like right there. So it's basically how are the Sky have more games, so they have a chance to jump ahead of the Fever if they play well. But I think to answer your question, I think I just got to go with Dallas. I mean, Dallas isn't good. They only got 4 wins right now, but they were a playoff team last year. Arike Ogunbowale has been solid so far while they're dealing with multiple injuries. Natasha Howard is back. Satu Sabally could be back after the Olympic break. So could Maddie Siegrist. They won't have much time to ease these players, ease Sabally and ease Siegrist back into action after the Olympic break. But if they are healthy, they should be a playoff team in my mind. And I think the biggest biggest obstacle for them has been playing on the road. They're just 2-9 on the road right now. So, obviously they played more road games than home games at this point. So, maybe the second half they get more home games, they get healthy and they string together some wins, and maybe they can jump the Fever.
Yeah, it feels like their margin for error is pretty slim down the stretch because they are sitting at just 4 wins right now. They're a couple games behind Indiana, who's in 8th. But I had them as a playoff team coming into the season, and it feels like if they can avoid injuries down the stretch, that they just have so much talent that they'll be able to at least win the games that they should down the stretch, and maybe even compete against some of the top teams like Connecticut, Las Vegas, Minnesota. We saw them beat the Lynx on Thursday, and that was even with being a little bit banged up. So I think that really showed what the Wings can do, and hopefully they can come back. Maybe some of their players will be kind of technically back to full health during the Olympic break, so they can get that conditioning down for when the Wings actually do return to play. Before we move on, if you enjoy content like this, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We've talked for most of the season about players to trade for, and time is running out, as Friday afternoon is the standard trade deadline in ESPN fantasy leagues. One player in the midst of a breakout season is Dearica Hamby, but she's had a few quieter performances recently. She's been held without a double-double in 5 consecutive appearances and was held below 25 ESPN fantasy points in 3 of those outings. Her decrease in production coincides with Cameron Brink's absence, which makes me a little bit nervous, but I'd still reach out to the fantasy manager with Hamby on their roster to see whether they'd like to make a trade at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that makes you a little nervous, but also missing Brink should at some point mean more opportunities for Hamby. So I think there's a little bit of regression to the mean, or whatever term you want to use there, coming for Hamby after this lackluster week plus. So I like making that move for Hamby, especially if you can get her at a discount.
Yeah, it feels like if the Sparks want to succeed, they're kind of in a similar position to the Wings, where they're at 4 wins, but in the WNBA, 4 wins at this point still means that you're in the playoff picture. It feels like if they want to compete down the stretch and make a push for the playoffs, that Dearica Hamby is going to be really crucial for the team.
I would have to agree with that statement. My first player to trade for is Ariel Atkins, guard for the Mystics. She scored more than 30 fantasy points in just 1 of her last 4 games. But with Shakira Austin, Brittany Sykes, Carly Samuelson all out for the foreseeable future, this is Atkinson's team, right? You might be able to get her for a discount, given her lack of superstar production lately. But I expect her to be a top point scorer during the second half of the season. And she's one of those players where I mentioned those 3 players who are going to be gone. That means more opportunities for Atkins. But even if those players return, Atkins is the type of player that, could feed off of Samuelson spacing the floor, or Sykes distributing to her, or Shakira Austin demanding some attention down low. So I don't think like her production is necessarily directly tied to those absences. I think she could have increased production with them gone, and she would maintain solid production even if those players come back.
Yeah, Washington feels like a team that's really similar to what we talked about with Dallas earlier, where they had a blow before the season with Elena Deladon stepping away from basketball. So we knew that they would probably take a step back, but the injuries that they've dealt with have just been decimating for them. And it sounds like Shakira Austin is going to travel with the team, so she could potentially return at some point. But we've seen Austin's minutes limited all season. So even if she's back on the court soon, Atkins will probably have a lot of chances to shine.
Yeah, the Austin situation was weird. Like, obviously, it was limited, and then started missing a lot of time due to the hip injury. And then it looked like she was limited in practice again. And then it looked like she was maybe past the hip, well, not past the hip injury, but like willing to play through the hip injury. And then she got sick, so it was like, oh, she's just sick. That's why she's missing this game. And then the illness designation was removed, and it was back to the hip injury. So I don't know. It's kind of been a confusing time. And whenever you get reports like that, like, you just can't trust anything, and just got to assume that Austin isn't going to be back anytime soon. But like you said, even if she does come back, she probably isn't going to be playing more than 20 minutes.
Right. And it's tough because we expected big things out of Austin this year. She has a lot of talent. So hopefully she can officially move past her hip injury sooner rather than later. But it seems likely that she'll at least have limitations once she's back in action. This is a pretty ambitious trade, but I would check to see whether Jewell Loyd, guard for the Storm, is available to trade for in your league. She's somewhat underwhelmed to begin the 2024 campaign, and she posted a season low 7 ESPN fantasy points during the loss to the Aces on June 19th. However, she's bounced back over her 3 appearances since then, including back-to-back performances with at least 30 points. The shot volume has been there all season, and if she can maintain her increased efficiency that she's shown across the past few games, I think that she should be a really solid contributor down the stretch, and you might be able to get elite production for kind of mid-tier value at this point.
Yeah, obviously Lloyd's fantastic player, high upside. And my only thing that I would add here is, like, maybe you could make an argument that with the new addition, Skylar Diggins-Smith coming over, Nneka Ogwumike coming over, Loyd was trying to like feel her way through her new teammates, and now it's time to hit the gas. And Jewell Loyd is, it's tough to say who the leader of this team. She is the incumbent, star player, so I feel like she probably has a little bit more of a leadership role within the organization, at least at this point. So yeah, I think like you can maybe make that argument that she was deferring to teammates or just trying to find her feel, and now it's foot on the gas, and obviously like super high upside player. So I like that trade. I'm moving to another, well-known name, Kelsey Mitchell, guard for the Fever. She started off slow. There's a little bit of an injury. She was working off the bench, a little bit of limitations, as we've been mentioning this whole time. But Mitchell has been fantastic since then. She's averaging 17.5 points over her last 18 games. She's scored in double figures in all but one of those 18 games. Caitlin Clark and Indiana's bigs, Aaliyah Boston, Howard, Nalissa Smith, like, these players get all of the attention in fantasy, but Kelsey Mitchell kind of just flies under the radar. She doesn't really put up peripheral stats, but her scoring production is so consistent, and I feel like you can really count on her to be a solid, consistent player if you are looking for postseason production already.
Yeah, and it feels like Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, even Nalissa Smith get most of the attention in Indiana, and rightfully so. All of them are really talented players, but like you mentioned with Jewell Loyd, Kelsey Mitchell has been in Indiana for a while now. She's in her 7th season with the team, and every year she has displayed just incredible scoring production and has also displayed that she's an effective passer. So I think that she flew under the radar heading into the season and is still flying under the radar, but she's averaging 16.3 points per game. So her scoring production has been there. Her like you said, her production in other areas can be a little bit iffy, but she's usually putting up like 25-ish ESPN fantasy points per night, which if you have her on your roster, I don't think you're ever disappointed with one of her scoring totals. So she's as consistent as they come, and if you can get her, especially at a discount, I think that she's worth trading for.
Totally. And like you said, like maybe if you have her rostered, you're probably pretty happy with the production she's delivering, but it hasn't really been superstar production. So maybe a manager is, at that 500 mark trying to get into the playoffs and is looking for a little more high upside, and you have some high upside players and you're looking for more consistency. It always depends on your league and how you communicate with your league mates.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the waiver pickups that we'll talk about a lot of times can be high upside, but also really low floor. And Kelsey Mitchell feels a little bit like the opposite. Her upside is there sometimes, but feels like she's pretty low upside, but a high floor. So if you can find a manager like in a situation where they could use that upside, I think that it could be beneficial for both sides. A player who is also coming off a lackluster performance is Jonquel Jones, front court option for New York, as she was held to 5 points and 4 rebounds during Sunday's win over Atlanta. However, she's consistently had games with 40 plus ESPN fantasy points this season and shouldn't be overlooked despite one poor performance. So her poor performance came at a pretty solid time with the trade deadline approaching. So if you can find someone who has maybe cooled on Jonquel Jones a little bit, I think that she could really come at a value for you.
Yeah, have Jonquel in multiple leagues this year, and when she does pop, you're like, holy cow! But and then it didn't count for fantasy, but she also had a pretty bad scoring performance during the Commissioner's Cup Championship last week. So a couple of iffy performances from her someone might be looking to sell. But yeah, I want Jones rostered in as many leagues as I possibly can. Moving
Yeah.
on to Go
And
ahead.
Jones has that really elite production so often that sometimes you just kind of get used to it. But then when she does have those poor performances, it makes you look back and like maybe you think that she's more inconsistent than she actually is. But when she's playing at her full potential, there aren't many players who are better than her.
That's a really good point. Like the actual surprise of a bad performance might like trigger because you're so used to the solid performances.
Mhm.
Moving on to my last player to trade for. This is kind of a risky one. It's Diana Taurasi, guard for the Mercury. Obviously, if you followed the WNBA at any point over the last 20 years, you know who she is. Look, she's old and she has been inconsistent this season. But if your team looking to the playoffs already and you want a high upside player, Kelsey Mitchell is my safe play. Diana Taurasi is my high upside player. You can probably get her at a discount given her inconsistent performances and where she was being drafted. She's definitely a risky play, but could have league winning upside if you can get her as a depth piece.
Yeah, and we mentioned Candace Parker earlier in the show, who is now retired, but a lot of people consider her one of the WNBA goats. Diana Taurasi is also well in the conversation for a WNBA goat. I was a little bit low on her coming into the season just because she struggled with availability over the past few years, whether it's for veteran load management or just injuries. Her games played have been a little bit limited, but this year she's played in every game for the Mercury and has had solid minutes in every appearance. She'll occasionally have the off scoring night when she just can't hit many shots from the floor, but for the most part, she's showing why she's the league's leading scorer all time. And if you can get her, she feels like one of those players, like we talked about with Jones, that she's pretty consistent, and when she does have those inconsistent performances, maybe it throws fantasy managers off of her a little bit. So I think that if she can stay on the court down the stretch, then she will be a really solid value for fantasy managers.
Yeah, and I mean Phoenix is treading water. They're 9-9 right now, so they're going to need as much as they can get out of her.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to our preview of this week's games, the Olympic break is under 3 weeks away, so we have a packed schedule coming up in the WNBA, starting with a rare two-game slate for a Monday tonight. I'm really intrigued to see the Sun and Mercury face off in Phoenix tonight, Both teams are coming off losses, but they have plenty of potential, so I'm interested to see which team can bounce back and return to the win column first.
Yeah, like I just said, Phoenix is treading water at 9-9. They will likely still make the playoffs, barring a complete collapse. But I don't know if they're proven that they can like play Cinderella in the playoffs, right? They obviously have all of the talent. I mean, I don't think you want to be like the Sun and go into facing Taurasi and Copper and Griner and all of these veteran players. But I just don't know if they've necessarily proven that they're a good team yet. They have a lot of talent, but they got to like stack some of these wins against elite teams. And one of the biggest downfalls for the Mercury so far has been their record on the road. They're 7-3 at home compared to 2-6 on the road. So this will be a good chance for Phoenix to get a big win against a great team at home. The only bad thing is it's the second night of a back-to-back. And like I just mentioned with Griner and Taurasi and Copper, like these are veteran players. And playing on the second night of a back-to-back can be tough for the veterans.
Yeah, and Diana Taurasi, after last night's loss to the Fever, talked about the crowd in Phoenix and how a lot of them seem to be rooting for Caitlin Clark and the Fever. Understandably, I think that seems to be wherever Caitlin Clark goes, her fans will follow. But it feels like tonight the Mercury could really get the X factor back on their side, which after Sunday night, I think would be an especially big boost. So I think that they'll have a little bit extra home court advantage, a little bit more than they usually do.
It's such a funny comment coming from her because when she was younger, she probably had a lot of opposing fan bases cheering for her too in games. So I feel like it was just a funny comment from Taurasi, but obviously like a little bit of a letdown loss at home, given, before that they were 7-2 at home, I think is what I said. So, good chance for them to bounce back after a bad home loss.
Yeah. And the action will continue tomorrow with the matchup between the Lynx and the Liberty. And it should also be exciting as two of the league's top teams will be facing off in a rematch of the Commissioner's Cup Championship. Although Minnesota won the Commissioner's Cup, it feels like this is anyone's game, especially if Benijah Laney Hamilton and Courtney Vandersloot are close to full strength in this one.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's no money on the line this time, but there's a lot of pride, and that's a big thing for athletes, right? Like I feel like the Liberty were probably pretty disappointed with that performance after they got out to a big lead. So I would not be shocked if this was a little bit more than a regular season Tuesday game, right? Like, but like no money on the line, so there's hard to make that assumption. It's just a guess in my book, but if I played for the Liberty, I would be circling this matchup like, all right, let's get our revenge. Let's prove that was an issue on our end. We let them come back and not they dominated us type of thing. I feel like that's just kind of how athletes always have to think, but it should be a very intriguing matchup on Tuesday.
Yeah, the Lynx have looked a little bit sluggish since winning the Commissioner's Cup. They lost to Dallas, and then they were behind for a lot of the game against Chicago on Sunday, but they wound up coming back and winning it. And it feels like the games against Dallas and Chicago, they're a little bit lower in the standings, so maybe they're using this chance to regroup a little bit. But against the Liberty, I think that they'll have to really be at full strength and using their full capacities and be on high alert. So I think that if the Lynx come out at full, like playing up to their potential, I think that it'll be a really good game.
Yeah, totally a good point. They definitely had a little bit of a hangover after stealing that win. Aside from the Commissioner's Cup rematch, Commissioner's Cup Championship rematch, I think, on Thursday you got Connecticut and Minnesota. I think that might be the best game of the week other than the Commissioner's Cup Championship rematch. They're both currently 14-4, second and third in the league. That'll obviously change by Thursday because they play games before then. But this contest could determine home court advantage in the playoffs. Obviously, we're both expecting these teams to make a deep run in the playoffs. So if they do match up, this game on Thursday could be determine whoever gets home court in that series, which is obviously very important, as we've talked about home versus away records multiple times already in the show.
Yeah, I think that it's like in the WNBA, every win counts in a 40-win season. And especially when you're playing against some of the other top teams in the league, you really have to make those games count. So I think that the Sun and Lynx will both be playing up to their full potential. And playing in Minnesota, I would probably give the slight advantage to the Lynx, but both teams certainly have the chance to pull out a win here. Before we close out, we have a viewer question from Nacho's Gone. He has Temi Fagbenle in his IR slot and is wondering if it's worth dropping Monique Billings for Temi Fagbenle, or do we think that Billings will be able to keep up solid productivity, or should he make the move to get Temi back in his lineup?
Go ahead. You go first.
Oh, no, go ahead.
All right. So Fagbenle played 19 minutes in her return and then only 13 minutes in the next game. Obviously, a little concerning there. And then on the Monique Billings side, she got moved out of the starting lineup a couple games ago. She played only 14 minutes off the bench in that first game, but then she played 30 minutes and 24 minutes, and then she was back to 13. So this is a really tough situation. Nacho's gone. Obviously, you've been a consistent viewer all season, so I want to give you my best advice. I think right now you probably just want to hold because, if you activate Temi, then you have to drop someone. But right now you can kind of just wait for Temi to explode before you have to make a decision and roll with Billings, even though Billings, might be stuck in that 18 to 22 minute role off the bench moving forward. But I think for now it's just a hold, and you hope Billings can give you some production, and then you also hope on the other end that Temi starts seeing 20 plus minutes, and then maybe you can make a move after Temi starts to get more minutes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the players are on a kind of opposite trajectories right now, where Monique Billings is falling a little bit, but Temi Fagbenle is on the rise, because Fagbenle has had her minutes limited, but it feels like she will be back up to full strength at some point, whereas the wings are only getting healthier, and Monique Billings has really earned her spot on this team, but she's also on a hardship contract, so we don't know exactly what will happen when the wings get back to full strength. But I think that I would hold Billings for now. I think that Fagbenle's ceiling that we're seeing right now is about where Billings's floor is. So I think that just rolling with Billings for a few more games, and if that flips, then Billings is droppable at some point. But Billings has still shown enough production off the bench that I'm still willing to roll with her.
Yeah, until Billings completely falls off from a production standpoint, I don't think that you really need to make a move right now. I mean, Billings, even with some of her reduced minutes, she's still been able to put up double-digit ESPN fantasy points. I mean, obviously, 12 fantasy points isn't the greatest performance ever. But I don't think you necessarily need to make the move right now, and making the move limits your roster flexibility in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So I think you just got to hold for now.
Yeah, and because if you are limited from making waiver pickups and really need to later in the week, I think that I would probably drop Fagbenle over Billings. I think that because Fagbenle is still flying under the radar right now, you might be able to add her back at some point, where Billings might be a little bit harder to get if you do wind up dropping her, because she's had that season-long production.
Yeah, and the last point that I would make, I think Billings has been more consistent, but Fagbenle, even off the bench and in limited less than minutes, she's scored nearly 30 ESPN fantasy points in her 2 games back. So it's a really, really difficult question. I'm team Temi overall, and I think you're team Billings overall, but I think we both agree that at this stage in the season, Billings has more value, especially if you have to lose a roster spot to make room for Temi.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that question. That does it for our Monday show. We'll be back this Friday at 1 p.m. Central to recap the week, so be sure to join us then. Thanks for watching.